Okay, so I'm starting the recording. So hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to the first GTAC seminar for this academic year. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Ronnie Cohen, who is the organizer of our seminar, and particularly for organizing this evening's event. Ronnie will be hosting the event. I'm just going to say, well, I was going to say a few things about GTAC, but since I think everyone here knows the project more or less, I will just say that we are a project that investigates translations from non-Jewish languages into Jewish languages during the early modern period. And we think of translation as being something that is very collaborative and interdisciplinary, and we try to kind of reproduce that approach in our own research. Ronnie, can you see people trying to come in? And yeah, okay, good. So interdisciplinarity is a very large part of the project, and so is collaborative research. Over the past 3 years, our seminar has hosted scholars from such varied fields as translation studies, history, both Jewish and European, comparative literature, gender studies, sexuality studies, German Jewish studies, Hebrew literature, and Yiddish literature. But this evening, we have with us a scholar whose corpus of work traverses these seemingly disparate fields of knowledge, transgressing and contesting the supposed boundaries between them. In her wide range of books and articles, Naomi Seidman moves with enviable erudition and ease from Bialik to Baba, from the history of Bible translation through its sexual politics of Hebrew and Yiddish, to the history of the Bes Yaakov movement. And tonight she will be discussing Freud. Naomi Seidman's work is characterized not only by its versatility, but also by its unique combination of bold innovation and sheer elegance. Her research has been recognized by numerous awards and fellowships, and she has positioned herself as one of the truly great scholars of modern Jewish literature and culture. And on a personal note, I'd just like to say that I constantly have one of her books on my desk, this one, Faithful Renderings, and every time I try to put it back on the shelf, I find myself just reaching for it again, so I just leave it there, and it's been there for some years. Naomi, it really is an immense privilege to have you with us tonight. And I would like to thank you for agreeing to open the GTAC seminar for this year. And with that, I'd like to ask Ronnie to host our event today.
So thank you very much, Iris. Hello, everybody. So I guess that for now, we all know why we're so excited to have Professor Seidman with us, but right now I'll give them more like a formal introduction. Professor Seidman is a Chancellor Jackman Professor of the Arts in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center of Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto, and a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow. Her publications include Faithful Renderings, which Iris mentioned before, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Politic of Difference from 2006, The Marriage Plot, or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature from 2016, and Sarah Schneerer and the Bes Yaakov Movement, A Revolution in the Name of Tradition from 2019, which won a National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. She is presently working on a study of Freud in Hebrew and Yiddish translation, and today she'll talk about a part from this present project. And her title, that maybe will be a little bit different right now, is A Godless Jew in the Holy Tongue, translating Freud into Hebrew or Yiddish, which is another holy tongue. So, Professor Seidman, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What an amazing introduction, and really nice to meet you. And I have to say that one of the pleasures of writing a book about Bes Yaakov is hearing everybody butcher the pronunciation of Bes Yaakov and Sarah Schneerer and all that. But you did an excellent job, Ronnie, so thank you for that. And thanks for asking. Hold on, let me just share my screen. So I somehow lost track of the email where I said what I would talk about. And I, last night, somehow got it in my head that I was going to introduce the whole entire book. A Godless Jew in the Holy Tongue is chapter 9, I think. And it's actually the one chapter that's not, that's really not finished. I mean, none of them are entirely finished, but so basically the book, I think, is going to be called The Navel of the Dream, Freud's Jewish Languages. And I think I'm going to try to tell you what the whole book is about. And it basically has two parts. And one part is the Jewish languages in Freud's writing. And the second part is the Jewish languages of Freud's, the translation of Freud's work. So the translation of Freud's work during his lifetime into Hebrew and Yiddish, and also in the years immediately after his death. I'm trying to figure out, so let me just share my screen. And here we go. So whenever I tell people I'm working on this project, the first question they always ask is, so how much Yiddish did Freud know? Or how much Hebrew did he know? Did he know any Yiddish? And then if somebody knows something, they'll say, oh yeah, he's talked to his mother in Yiddish, right? So we basically have been asking this question for a long time. And here's just a little taste of the weird kind of collection. I call this a well-thumbed pack of cards. You know, whenever you get into anything Freud related, there's a lot of people looking really closely at the corpus. So these are the, what do we have here on the bottom right, the Hebrew poem that Freud's father inscribed in a book on his 37th birthday. I think if any of you who know the sort of cottage industry of the Jewish Freud, you're familiar with this. The Rat Man, the only case that we have the case notes for, because Freud destroyed his notes for all the other cases, we have a couple of weeks or months. So according to the notes, every session, and you wouldn't know from the published case study that the Rat Man was Jewish, but if you read the case notes, he started every session by cursing Freud in, I would say, intermediate or even occasionally advanced Yiddish curses, as opposed to, if we want to grade the curses along the line of beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And then Freud has a dream, which has a Hebrew word, and he claims that he has to ask philologists what this Hebrew word means, despite and a lot of the critics make a big deal of, why would you have to ask a philologist what a word that you yourself dreamt means? But I actually don't have a problem understanding that particular thing. So I'm not writing a book about how much Yiddish or Hebrew Freud knew. What I'm actually writing a book about is why people have been asking this question and why people have been digging up these little references to Hebrew and Yiddish. And this is already an old story. The Yiddishist and psychologist A.A. Robach wrote a book called Freudiana, where he actually collects some of these instances, and he also asks Freud whether he knows Yiddish. And when Freud says, no, not really, he asks him again. So my question is, and I think some of you are familiar with Freud's Moses, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book about how much Hebrew Freud knew. In all these cases, it isn't just a question that can be answered. There's something else at play, which is what could be called a hermeneutics of suspicion. The answer is generally something like, Freud knew more Hebrew/Yiddish than he was willing to cop to. This is what could be called the ideology of the question, the shape of the question, the reason why the question keeps being asked even after we know the answer. So the question that I want to ask is, why do we want to know this particular thing? And what do we think we know when we're asking this question? So what we think we know is something about what I'm calling roughly the linguistic architecture of modern Jewish subjectivity. So the language landscapes of assimilated Jews, or the children of Jews who speak who are born to parents who speak Yiddish, or in the case of Canetti, Ladino fluently, and what their language landscape is. And in the case of George Steiner, he gives a very detailed description of the kind of layered languages that he considers a dimension of modern. He's obviously older than Freud, but characteristic of a certain kind of acculturated European Jew. And in Elias Canetti, it's a very similar structure, with not Yiddish at what you might call the bottom, but Ladino. So Ladino is forming a certain kind of unconscious layer of his psyche. He uses the word unconscious. I should have quoted that. So this notion that the unconscious speaks Yiddish is, let's say, alive and well, and whether expressed explicitly or implicitly in a range of different writings. So this Max Kahn is a psychoanalyst and a Yiddishist who writes about Freud and Yiddish. And the first sentence of his book is, "My unconscious speaks Yiddish." Max Weinreich, Freud's Yiddish translator, spoke of the connection between Yiddish as part of the collective unconscious of American Jews in particular, whether it's the case for Jews who speak Yiddish as a daily vernacular is a different question. But so if this is part of the conversation he had with the Israeli literary critic Dan Miron, the last conversation they actually had before his death, in which Max Weinreich said Yiddish is the language that American Jews speak in their dreams. In other words, during the day they speak English. When they dream in Yiddish, just like Freud himself apparently dreamt in Hebrew. It's the idiom of their collective unconscious. For their personality to become whole, at least some of them will have to go back to Yiddish someday, and there we shall be, we Yiddishists, waiting for them down in the Yiddish cellar with a strong torchlight in our hand. Someone will have to spell out for them the contents of their dream, to elucidate the vision they saw with bleary eyes. And we, because we made Yiddish Wissenschaft the thing we live and die for, we will be able to throw light and heal. I hope that what we've already, just what I've kind of established here, or this very small selection of citations, gives you a sense of a certain kind of overlap between Freud's, let's say, layered notion of the conscious and the unconscious, and a certain kind of ideology about the Jewish languages that lay buried in the dreams of assimilated Jews who may speak a different language during the day, and the association between these Jewish languages and the unconscious. And this idea that, I'm actually trying to remember why I put that slide up, and it's not coming back to me. So I'm going to move to the next one. So this is what happens when you're just speaking off the cuff, I guess, and not reading from a paper. I think I got the slideshow linked to a more formal paper, but aren't you glad I'm not reading it? So what I wanted, the reason why I'm giving you this particular slide of Rabbi Nachman's tales is that the idea that Yiddish mostly as a kind of heritage language and ancestral tongue, perhaps an initial native tongue that's been forgotten, that erupts at certain moments of, in which the unconscious is allowed to speak and at other times is repressed, is not an inevitable and ahistorical dimension of Jewish languages. And I'll just point out that the usual way of understanding Jewish languages is not European languages on top and a Jewish language underneath, but actually Hebrew on top and Yiddish underneath. And the reason that this ideology is so strong, that in the case of the Hebrew translations of Rav Nachman's tales by Nathan Steinhartz, Hebrew translation is on the top of the page, where normally the original is, and the Yiddish is below. Now, this below means something very different than the below of Weinreich's cellar. The below of Weinreich's cellar is a below of repressed unconsciousness. Maybe we can also say intimacy, privacy, intimate Jewish spaces versus public European spaces. Here below is a kind of status of a lower status, less holy, less sacred. I think in this particular group, I don't have to speak much further on this, but this is just to say that some dramatic, not only the usual dramatic, the story we know of the reclamation of Yiddish, first of all, as a language, and then as a language with peculiarly intimate affect, Mamaloshon, Yiddishkeit, das Pintele Yid, that all that is not only a transformation of how a language is understood, but also a transformation of what lowness means. That lowness itself is seen in such psychological terms, in terms of an insider discourse versus an outsider discourse. And this is now so basic to the way we understand the language, that even in quote unquote neutral and non-sentimental or romanticized notions of the language, like Weinreich's internal bilingualism versus external bilingualism, the idea that being that the languages Jews speak among themselves is somehow more internal than the languages that they speak with non-Jews, which is external, that just seems absolutely natural to us, even though just as a thought experiment, you could say that the Jewish language could be seen as external because it transcends the boundaries of Poland to be Warsaw, New York, Tel Aviv. I mean, I'm not saying that anyone said this, but it's possible to say this. In other words, this is a contingent ideology that continues to function, whether or not it's true or not. I'm thinking of A.J. Heschel's description of German Jews who came back to Judaism in 1933 as reverse Marranos, Jewish only on the inside, and actually Jewish only on the outside, and German on the inside. And we, we're living in an age of surface reading and post-vernacular Yiddish, and Yiddish on t-shirts and mugs. So I think we're now at a point that this ideology can manifest itself as an ideology, as opposed to just as simple reality. And I hope it's clear what I'm talking about in terms of an ideology, the ideology of the interior character of Yiddish, the interior, intimate, affect-laden. So I'll just say that Freud himself did not use, sorry, I should look at my watch, but he didn't use what I'm calling the linguistic architecture or archaeology as his basic model of the psyche. As is well known, he used the model of archaeology to think about the layers of the self. And in terms of his archaeology, this archaeology was not the archaeology of the Temple Mount, but of mostly Troy. It was really interested in and as we know from the various artifacts all around his rooms, his clinical treatment rooms and his office, those were Greek and Chinese archaeological artifacts, for the most part, Egyptian, etc. Nevertheless, there's a very interesting little moment when he lays out the archaeological model for the first time in a famous talk that he gave on hysteria in 1895. It's famous for other reasons than this, but it's also famous for this, where he really very elaborately, beautifully, and poetically describes the psyche as a rune, as an archaeological rune. And maybe I don't need to read this whole thing. I'll give you a minute to read it, but the explorer arrives at a rune. He could question the people who live there about what's going on, but what are they going to know? But maybe he will start digging, and what he'll find, and I think this is very interesting, if he's lucky, and this is toward the end, the numerous inscriptions by good luck may be bilingual, reveal an alphabet and a language and when they've been deciphered and translated, yield undreamed of information about the events of the remote past, to commemorate which the monuments were built. Stones talk. So obviously what Freud was thinking about was the Rosetta Stone, which allowed hieroglyphics to be deciphered through Demotic Greek over the course of the 19th century. And Freud followed this with great, this was his hobby when he was a child, was archaeology. And he was very interested in this notion of translation as a kind of feature of unconscious work. So the dream, just to spell this out, the dream or the symptom is basically a translation of a wish or a trauma into images, right? So it's an intersemiotic translation, to use Jacobson's language, which then gets translated from these images into the narration of the dream in the psychoanalytic session. And then the psychoanalyst is herself a translator who then turns, reaches back from the secondary reconstruction to what may have been the original trauma or symptom, if you can imagine reaching back. So that basically psychoanalysis is a complicated form of not exactly translation, but what could be called detranslation, or translation and detranslation, that both of those mechanisms are operative. So as some of you no doubt know, I'm sure Yael knows, the major case that helped Freud and Breuer in their studies on hysteria work through a symptom, worked through their theory of the unconscious that was explicated in 1895, was the case of Anna O, otherwise known as Bertha Pappenheim, who bizarrely also is a figure in my Beis Yaakov research, and who was, maybe I'll just say, so who was, what was, she had a hysteria, which basically was a translation of her, it's interesting, she translated the trauma of her father's death into a paralysis of first her right arm, and then and contracture of her whole body, and then speech aphasia. So it's somewhat remarkable that her hysteria manifests itself precisely in the terms that we see in Psalm, what number is it? 137, 127? Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini tidbak lashoni lechiki im lo eshkachechi, etc. So she had a very, let's say, Hebraic hysteria. I'm not entirely sure what to do with this, especially since she found herself unable to speak during her hysteria. Let's read a little bit of it. And this is from the case study, Breuer's case study. Later, she lost command. She at first had these contractures, a disorganization of speech. She had a hard time finding her words. She lost grammar and syntax. She no longer conjugated verbs. She omitted. It's incredibly bizarre that hysteria should be almost a lesson in grammar, or what maybe we could call a de-grammarization. In the process of time, she became almost completely deprived of words. It actually began, her hysteria begins with her wanting to pray, and she's unable to come up with the words. And it doesn't say what language she was praying in. So she started to put together sentences out of 4 or 5 languages, became almost intelligible. And then when she tried to write, she employed the same jargon. And here in the German, the word jargon appears. And whether jargon means the mixture of 4 or 5 languages that is the symptom of her hysteria, or the what we called later Yiddish, seen as an unnatural mixture of at least 3 languages. But in any case, the word Hebrew or Yiddish does not appear in what's actually an incredibly detailed description of Bertha Pappenheim's hysteria, which also manifested itself as a kind of miraculous translation performance. They would give her, she stopped being able to read, to speak German, but they'd give her a German newspaper and she would translate it into English or into Italian. So as we know that Bertha Pappenheim, Hebrew and Yiddish, especially Yiddish, were among her languages. She later, we know she translated from Yiddish. She also translated into Yiddish with Alexander Rebbe when she went to speak to him about the problem of prostitution among women in Eastern Europe. And here you have, this is just a random page from her diary where she's describing a conversation that she's having with the Rebbitzin, Alexander Rebbitzin, or maybe it was Alexander Rebbe's sister. You can see it's a mixture of, you see the word yam there, there's a little Yiddish there, there's a Rabbeinu Shalom, the Rebbe, mein Bruder, there's a Leben. What language is this is difficult to discern. And yet this is not the hysteric being diagnosed by psychoanalysis. This is the one who found a cure, you could call it, through the ideology of appropriating, a talking cure, we can call it, of translating and appropriating Jewish languages for modernity as part of the modern Jewish renaissance of German Jewry. Okay, so I realize I've been talking for a really long time already, so let me just say that it's very obvious that Freud was well aware of this ideology that I'm talking about, even if he didn't speak explicitly about it. In the case of Bertha Pappenheim, Anna O, he has jokes that hinge upon this joke about the Baroness on Feischenfeld, who's in labor, and the husband and doctor are playing cards outside, and she says in French first, "Ach mon Dieu que je souffre." And the husband springs up, the doctor says, no, let's get on with the game. Then she says, mein Gott, was für Schmerzen. Aren't you going in? Asked the Baron. No, not time. And then she says, ai, which in the Yiddish joke book of the time is oy vey is mehr, or something like that. The doctor throws down the card and says, now it's time. So this is a joke that's really funnier if one recognizes the Yiddish that's hidden partially in this description of it. It's also a translation performance, and it also suggests that translation doesn't just work in one direction, which psychoanalysis could also teach us, which is translation from translation works in at least two directions. So from the symptom and trauma into the dream, and then from the dream back into the symptom and trauma. And you see exactly that same structure here. The first thing that manifests itself, we can call it the kind of symptom that needs to be deconstructed, is the Jew speaking French or the Jew speaking German. And then the translation is, far from being a faded copy of an original, is itself an attempt at a reconstruction of an original, which is also the dream of translation into Jewish languages. This is, let's see how much time. Okay, so I'll just try to wrap this up. So my question is, to what extent, we already know that Weinreich very explicitly believed Yiddish to be a kind of unconscious of the Jew, or the unconscious to be infused with the assimilated Jew that persists somehow within or beneath the German. And then what I do is I ask the question of, is it the case that these translations, which feel themselves, they certainly feel themselves to be getting at something powerful about Freud's origins, do they actually manage to, what we might call, is translate Freud toward a more original truth, toward Freud's more original truth? What happens when you take Freud's German and try to set them in these Jewish languages that these translators believe, and to some extent that Freud himself believes, to be a kind of deeper original than his German? And this is a notebook that's a kind of Yiddish Hebrew version of, Weinreich called it the Freud Laboratory, Freud Laboratoria. And this reminds us, of course, that the question of, is psychoanalysis a Jewish science, which Freud answered in the negative, becomes something else altogether when it finds itself in the realm of, not Wissenschaft, but Yiddische Wissenschaft, in which Yiddish inflects Wissenschaft. It's not just that Wissenschaft analyzes Yiddish, but that Wissenschaft becomes a kind of Wissenschaft by virtue of its being written in Yiddish and in Hebrew characters. So what happens in Yiddische Wissenschaft in its laboratory working with Freud is the basic question of the rest of my book. And these are some of the early, well, I'll just pass along on the Yiddish translations. I'll move to some of the Hebrew ones just to wrap up. And I'll say that the Totem and Taboo, Yehuda Dever Devosis, Freud's first translator that worked with Freud, which was complicated because he didn't have a phone and they had to like make an appointment. Devosis would go to a cafe at a prearranged time to consult with Freud. Freud allowed Devosis to add these very dramatic footnotes that are on almost every page, in which, despite the fact that Freud says very explicitly that he's not talking about biblical religion, Devosis found echoes of totemism everywhere in not only the Bible, but also the persistence of the Bible in modern Jewish life. He claimed that all the, I'm trying to think if anyone here has a totemic name, but all the, Aryeh and Dov and all those were totems, and that Jews and the Bible and the Talmud all had totemic roots. So basically, Dever Devosis found Jewish biblical roots in everything Freud said, and Freud himself, despite denying this, also had some kind of effective relationship with these translations. He didn't charge royalties to any of the Hebrew Yiddish translators, and when he got the page proofs of Totem V'Taboo, which might lead you to think that actually there are no Hebrew equivalents for the basic terms of that book, he had some kind of intensive effective reaction to just the physical, the image of the script, the Hebrew script, which obviously he recognized, and the sense of himself as clothed in this strange language that he couldn't read, that was nevertheless part of him in some deep way, as he said. I'm really interested also in the psychopathologia shel Chaye Yom Yom, which is a little bit after Freud's death. It comes out, I believe, in 1942, if I'm remembering that right, by Tzvi Wisłowski. None of these people, none of these Hebrew translators or Yiddish translators for that matter, were trained psychoanalysts. And Freud was translated as part of a series called Ligvulam in Mossad Bialik. If people know about Ligvulam, Iris, this is really part of your project. Ligvulam, as you could tell from the V'shavu banim ligvulam, the idea was it will bring back European Jews who wrote in other languages into their boundaries, right, into the Hebrew language. And the Heine, Freud, I think, I'm trying to remember, Spinoza. So they were actually criticized by people on the right because why are they translating converted Jews? And the Shmuel Bergman, who's the editor-in-chief of the series, is like, Dafka converted Jews. That's what we need to do. We're going to convert them back. And what people don't, this effect, the idea of, and when he first spoke about this with Bialik, and his last conversation with Bialik, Bergman's conversation with Bialik, he said, the Nazis are burning these books and we will rescue them and redeem them through this Zionist translation project. So Freud is translated within this very particular context of what could be called salvage translation, rescue translation. And by the way, the standard edition in English, that same plea was made. The standard edition was launched the day of Freud's funeral. And the idea was Freud is being destroyed in his own language, in his own tongue, and we will rescue him in English. The same thing was going on in Palestine. And with a different effective charge. We're rescuing him in a language that is his. We can't anymore save his life. We can't anymore bring him to our country, right? People were desperate to get Freud to come to Palestine. He kept apologizing. And then Anna Freud, maybe she'll come. And she didn't come either. So there's a complicated affect around bringing Freud to Israel. This is just a particularly interesting passage. This is from the Psychopathology of Everyday Life about breaking things. So Freud's talking about breaking things, and there's a very interesting, so most of the chapter is about maids who break his fancy little sculptures, right? You can imagine, they're constantly just, so he can understand that. And then there's this interesting moment when he confesses that he himself has been breaking things. Okay, I have to move the piece. Shel charsina, shel clay zkuchit v'charsina. Af ani chalki haya meruba b'nezakim ele. So one of the things about this particular passage is this whole passage of breaking shvirat hakelim is an excellent illustration of Sholom's argument that you start speaking Hebrew and suddenly you're a mystical. So this is basically about shvirat hakelim, but Freud actually himself, this isn't just about the return of the repressed in Hebrew, right? The return of the dynamic Jewish unconscious, the urge to power that Sholom believes that Lurianic Kabbalah is about. So aside from that, sorry, I'm having a hard time moving our faces and I can't read the Hebrew, but he confesses, as some of you can see, I think you're able to move yours. Oops, sorry. He confesses that it's very easy to understand this particular epidemic. Elu hayamim shekadmu, and now I'm reading from memory, le'erusei biti habchira, am I remembering that right? So I've looked at this a lot, you get that idea? These are the moments, these were the days before my eldest daughter's wedding, maybe erusin. And for those of you who know, it's not clear, is he breaking zchuchit, which would be maybe like the groom breaks under the chuppah, or is he breaking charsina, which the mothers-in-law break at a tanayim, right? So there are two, one, and which is no longer done outside of the Orthodox world. So we have here a very complicated question, translation question, about what exactly is being broken and why. In either case, it doesn't look good for Freud. He's either the groom of his oldest daughter or he's the mother-in-law. Either way, as I said, it doesn't look good. I'm finally able to move it. But there's also this moment where there seems to be this fantasy that the Hebrew will recollect this, is, at least to my mind, completely dashed. And by the way, notice that Freud himself is expressing his sadness about not having a traditional either marriage or betrothal for his oldest daughter. And for those of you, if this was a room full of psychoanalysts, you would all be going, aha, 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 because as we know from Jones, Freud wanted his oldest daughter, Matilda, I believe her name was, to marry his star student, Sander Ferenczi. On the day of the wedding, he writes a letter saying, I have to be honest, I wished it was you. In other words, it isn't just that Freud wants to have a Tanaim. He wants to be in a position of a traditional parent arranging the marriage of his oldest daughter to his star, his Eloi, his star, in his yeshiva, which, by the way, in the way most of these people refer to psychoanalysis during this period is Torah Freud. When they try to describe Freud talking about Moses, it's Moshe Rabbeinu v'Torah Freud. What happens then is a kind of unconscious or unintentional kind of clash of ideas, either between the godless Jew and the sacred tongue, or within the godless Jew himself, who has a kind of eruption of these sacred traditional moments. And I'll just point out that this idea that what happens after this is that Nohagim, and whether it's Nohagim or Nahagu, is this past or present? And obviously, the question of what's past and what's present in the unconscious is also not so easy to answer. But the idea that what they did is, and b'derech klal lenafetz kli ulvarech al hashvarim, livarech al hashvarim. I don't think so. What they did is they broke the plate and they called out Mazel Tov. They didn't bless the broken pieces, the shards. So the fantasy, I would say, of recovery, which is implicit in Freud, is the dream of psychoanalysis and the dream of the Jewish translators of psychoanalysis into Jewish languages, is here demonstrated to be a kind of wish. Freud is lost in German, and he's only further lost in Hebrew, is at least partly the message of what I have to say here. I think we have to remember that Freud, once again, was not an archaeologist, but a collector, and that the time has come for a more surface reading of Freud, or what Yael Segalovich would say is a reading of Freud using evenly suspended attention. And anyway, thank you. I think that's what I got for now. I hope that made sense, and I really want to hear what you have to say about that. I'm so glad you're here, Yael. Yael, I learned so much about Freud from Yael. And so much about Yiddish from Aya.
Thank you very much. I learned so much about Freud from you today because I'm completely ignorant with everything after the 18th century. So thank you very much. I think we have
I don't know why my video, oh, there I am.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say, but here you are again. I think we have time for a few questions. We don't have a lot of time. I think something like 15 minutes. So if anybody would like, so this is your chance. And I think I saw that Aya unmuted herself. So
thank you very much. This was amazing. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit. Maybe Freud had different attitudes toward the translation of his writings to Hebrew and to Yiddish, because, for example, Heinrich Gretz really opposed being translated into Yiddish, but it didn't help him. It was translated anyway, and the text was manipulated in the process so as to be adequate for Eastern European Jewry. So I was wondering.
I need that reference.
Okay, I'll send it to you. So I was wondering if Freud also had these reservations and, wasn't comfortable with him being translated into Yiddish or written about in Yiddish, like what Weinreich did.
Whether he felt uncomfortable about being translated into Yiddish. So Freud was translated into Yiddish late. 1928 was the first translation. And hi, Yael, I didn't recognize you for a minute. The other Yael Sela. So by the time Freud was translated into Yiddish, the notion that we're talking about jargon and not a proud language. In other words, Freud lived through and participated in and knew about the recovery of Yiddish as a national Jewish language, and served on the board, the honorary board of the YIVO, was in pretty close contact with Weinreich at the end of his life. The last chapter of my book is about the sort of almost collaboration between Freud and Weinreich on the question of why Jews are afraid of dogs. And one of Freud's last meetings outside of his family was with 3 members of YIVO in London, including, I think, Yankov Steinberg, the territorialist. So Freud was very interested in and aware of developments in, and he also knew that Weinreich was popularizing psychoanalysis in Yiddish, and he was very interested in it. So when he said that he expressed emotion at getting the page proofs of Reinfirm Psychoanalyse, which was Weinreich's unfinished translation of his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, which so there's no doubt that he had a real regret, and he said over and over again that he regretted that he had lost his Yiddish. And of course there's a whole string of people who say, oh, he's lying, he actually still had his Yiddish. I don't think so. I don't think he would have expressed regret as often, as openly as he did. And maybe he had more, exactly how much Yiddish he had. I think he really did feel regret. And and it's clear he had some Yiddish, right? He had the interpretation of dreams was translated by I believe his younger brother, quote unquote, not translated, but his younger brother, Alexander, who he was very close to. This brother worked for the railroad company and they traveled together a lot. He wrote a book, a kind of parody of interpretation of dreams, where he, instead of talking, and he calls it the interpretation of Chalaimus. So he had in other words, he knew about his translation into Yiddish. It was happening in his own family as a sort of joke. And I think it was a family joke. People appreciated it and liked it. I mean, he had affection for Yiddish. Somebody just said he couldn't stand Eastern European Jews. He didn't entirely understand them. He kept explaining to them that he was an atheist and not understanding that they were all atheists too. Not all of them, but certainly Weinreich. So there was a little bit of like a set of projections, but the projections were not all negative. Like he believed them all to be sort of like his father, and that's all complicated. But I'm sorry, does that begin to answer the question? Yeah, thanks. I think Yael has her hand up, right? Hi, Yael.
Yeah, hi, Naomi, thank you.
It's so funny that we've never met, but we spent like a year on Zoom twice a week.
Good to see you, thank you. I do have a question about the joke about the woman going into labor and translation. But before that, I just want to mention, I think I've mentioned this to you before, the breaking of the glass the night before the wedding is...
The night before the wedding?
It's before the wedding. It's Polterabend. It's a non-Jewish German custom. Polterabend, where you break the guests break glass, porcelain as an omen, for just a good luck omen.
Oh my God. Wait, so it's funny. Yeah. You guys probably know Ellie Moseson. Ellie Moseson wants to write a book called The Jewish Origins of Everything. So now, is it Jewish or is it German? Oh my God, that's amazing.
But about the woman going into labor and I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about how you understand translation of the psyche, of the unconscious, as kind of a hermeneutical process. And I had to think of something of Spinoza's idea of prophecy as hermeneutics, as a kind of translation of something that has no words, of the Holy Spirit, of the Spirit of God, as it were, which is something that cannot be uttered and is therefore translated, as it were, into the poetry of the prophets. And I was wondering whether that is sort of the kind of hermeneutical process that you see in that sort of expression.
I really like the way you just put it, because, sorry, I just interrupted, but I like it because one of the problems with the ideology I'm just describing of Yiddish and the unconscious is that the unconscious has to also include affects and body, and that it's a way of and that Yiddish itself is already a language with a grammar. Yiddish itself, if we can call that a language with a grammar. In other words, the name of the father, Yiddish is also the name of the father, as well as being the Mama Lashon. And it's a kind of misreading of what language is. And for Freud, it's obvious that language is a dimension of translation, but it includes event, body, image, a range of other things that are left out when you equate the unconscious with Yiddish. And so the notion, and Freud's theory of translation includes all this, and then translation theorists that work with Freud's material, like Laplanche, has this notion of translation as that which actually is the opposite of understood, that which remains. So, no, I'm sorry. Let me get this straight. The notion of translation that he's using is that the unconscious consists of those aspects of language that don't get understood, that the child receives, that remain undigested, and thus not understood, and thus signifiers that never reach the level of signification. So the kind of the materiality of language is also what is what remains stuck, and that the psychoanalytic session, there's also this notion of Nachträglichkeit, which is which has been mobilized to recognize the temporal dimension of translation as that which comes after, and that which comes after not necessarily meaning that which is belated, faded, unfaithful, but that which gives you another chance at going at the problem again, which is what psychoanalysis is, right? It's like, or, as we say, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, or an unhappy childhood for that matter. So in other words, the psyche works through a kind of delay in terms of its comprehension, that especially sexual trauma of children who don't understand sexuality, and not just trauma, but also for Laplanche, just adult sexuality in general is seen as undigestible, is perceived as undigestible to the child. And so that the digestion of the problem is translation and it's psychoanalysis. Does that make sense? And the untranslatable and the indigestible and the non-linguistic are all part of this dynamic.
Thank you. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
I feel like I've been working on this book for so long, and I'm still so terrified of all these psychoanalytic concepts that I feel like I'm barely hanging on to. But yeah, Elle will tell me.
Yes, so I think we have time for one small short question. So Yael, yeah.
Okay. Well, the question could be long. The answer.
Yeah, the answer will be short.
Naomi, you always blow my mind, really. It was so beautiful, and Edith is here to testify to the fact that I say that even when you're not around. So I have two quick questions. One, why the navel, and in the title, and then second, if we think about it comparatively, what happens with the translation into English? I mean, I'm thinking of Freud's hatred of the US and I'm bringing them the plague. Did he have a different emotional reaction to it?
It's so interesting. I don't like my title, but I'll defend it for
I
the
love
moment
it.
because I've been asked to. I mean, you do like it?
I did.
So Freud, when Freud says that you're never going to finish interpreting something because there's a navel to the dream, he actually doesn't mean what I, for a long time, thought he meant, which is the mysteries of our own minds. He means that because language is intersubjective, because culture is intersubjective, because my psyche is also the psyche of, introjected from my parents, et cetera, there's no boundary to, in other words, my psyche, what I know is not a boundary to the to what the dream means. And this is actually how I understand Freud's consulting philologists to understand his own dream. And this moment in which he consults philologists that at least 2 or 3 different Jewish studies people who look at the Jewish Freud make fun of as proof that he's hiding something, is to me the opposite, which is that there are things that are at the border of our knowledge and are not and other people's knowledge. There are things that at the border of my knowledge. I mean, I'm sitting here, you guys are in Israel, your Hebrew is obviously much better than mine. And yet there are things that I sort of half know that you can explain better to me. Like right now I'm trying to figure out what the distinction is between the Tat Muda and Mitachat lahakara and Yidiyah and Muda and Hakara and all these things that are very deep in your knowledge, language knowledge, that are more superficial in mine. And that I know a dictionary, can help me to a certain extent, but that I would go to I use these words, and nevertheless, someone else knows something that I don't know. That's how I see it. So the reason why I'm interested in his Hebrew and Yiddish translators is because his Hebrew and Yiddish translators are the philologists that can interpret Freud's dreams. The word gezerah, which he says is a Hebrew word, he actually gets that a little wrong because it's 1903. It's a Lashon Kodesh word in Yiddish. So, thank you very much, Freud. Ask a philologist. That's absolutely right. And why philology and psychoanalysis actually go together in a very intimate way. That translation helps us see. What was the other question? Should I call it the pupik of the dream? I don't know. I forgot the second question.
The second question was about the American case. But I do want to say.
Oh, the American case. Yeah, I've gotten a little obsessed with Brill, his first American. So Brill was Freud's first, until Brill got fired, and Freud went with the Anglo Wasps. Oh, oh my God, I haven't seen him in so long. Brill was the first translator of Freud into English. Brill's German, pretty much like mine, was basically Yiddish. Yiddish was his native language. There are people talking about how thick his Yiddish accent was. Freud was basically brought to America with a guy whose Yiddish accent was so thick that you couldn't write about Brill without mentioning it. So basically, the English had a Yiddish accent. I don't know how else to think about it, but who Brill was, and then why Freud fired him and went with Jones, and why Jones made fun of him, and what his mistakes are, I think are really relevant to the same question, even though it's an English translation.
Thank you. I'll write the rest of the email.
Oh my God, I want emails from everybody who just mentioned. I got a couple of private little messages. Yeah, so I'm really please, I'm trying to scribble notes, but I'm not doing such a good job. You guys are so lucky. What a great little group this is and project, and thank you so much for including me in it.
Thank you so much
Thank you
for coming and talk with us. So
thank you. Bye.
In Rio.
Bye. And
Bye.
Bye.
That
I
makes
think
sense, right? Yeah. It's the first time I tried to give the whole picture of the book at once. Okay,
yes,
Frida
it
just
did make
nodded.
sense.
I'll take that as an affirmative.
I'm a boss lady. I can almost get away with that.
See you back.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think our next session will be our next talk will be like 2 months ago, 2 months from now. I
So
think,
we
or
have
in December.
Abigail Gilman is also coming to talk with us on campus, not on Zoom, but you're all very, very welcome to join us. And then after that, we have Astrid Lemke presenting on Zoom.
Yes, so we hope to see you in our next meetings. So thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
תודה רבה, תודה על ההזמנה.
תודה.
Bye.
Thanks for letting me
Bye.
join.
Thank you. רגע, אני אעצור את ההקלטה.